Motorcycle displacement can be confusing. Somehow a 650cc motorcycle makes less power than a 600cc bike, and your dad's 2000cc Harley isn't faster than your buddy's 1000cc crotch rocket. We're going to do a deep dive on motorcycle displacement and help you demystify why some bikes make more power than others. Motorcycle engine displacement, or really any engine displacement, refers to the area of the cylinder volume swept by the pistons within an engine. Motorcycle displacement is typically measured in cubic centimeters, or if you're at a Harley-Davidson, cubic inches. It is commonly used to refer to the general size of an engine and can imply a rough idea of how much power an engine will make. This gets a little more complicated in the motorcycle world, as engine design and intended purpose will have a huge bearing on how a motorcycle will make its power. But if we are speaking generally about engines without regard for those that are ultra-high revving or utilize forced induction, we can assume that an engine with a larger displacement will generally make more power. In order to determine an engine's total displacement, we have to pull out our scientific calculators and do a little bit of number crunching. Before you're able to calculate an engine's total displacement, you will have to know the bore and stroke of each of the engine's cylinders. The bore is quite straightforward, as it refers to the diameter of the piston in an engine. The stroke can be a little more confusing to noobs, as stroke has a few different meanings within an internal combustion engine. When talking about size, the stroke refers to the length of the travel the piston takes during each engine cycle. Not to be confused with the different parts of an engine cycle, like the intake stroke, compression stroke, power stroke, and exhaust stroke in a 4-stroke engine. So, if you know an engine's bore, stroke, and the number of cylinders, you can calculate its total displacement. So grab your nearest TI-83 and follow along with me. First, enter the number 531.8008. That decimal place is important because bore and stroke are typically measured in millimeters and total displacement is in cubic centimeters, so don't forget that. And then spin your calculator upside down and take a look. Pretty neat, right? Okay, then backspace all that and write this formula down, as it will be on the test. Total displacement is equal to stroke length multiplied by pi over 4 multiplied by bore cubed times the number of cylinders. For instance, to find the total displacement of the Kawasaki ZX6R, which has a 67mm bore and a 45.1mm stroke and 4 cylinders, you would do 4.51 converted in centimeters multiplied by pi divided by 4 multiplied by 6.7 squared multiplied by 4, and you would get 636 cc's. Math! Also, you could just look it up online. Their cc's are readily available. Something to consider when talking about an engine's bore and stroke is how it will affect the performance and behavior of an engine is to look at its bore and stroke ratio. An engine's bore and stroke can be under square, square, or over square. An under square edge will have a bore and stroke ratio less than 1. For example, Harley-Davidson 117 cubic inch Milwaukee 8 engine has a 4.075 inch bore and a 4.5 inch stroke, giving an under square ratio of 0.91. An under square engine design gives the Harley its unique power delivery of huge torque figures super low in the rev range, nearly instantaneously sometimes, at the expense of a very low RPM redline. Under square engines are also referred to as long stroke engines. Alternatively, an engine can be over square. This is when the piston bore is larger than the stroke, giving it a ratio of less than 1. Think of your super high revving race bikes like an R6, which has a bore and stroke of 67 and 42.5 millimeters respectively, giving an over square ratio of 1.58. The short stroke of an over square engine allows the pistons to rev very high without damaging the engine internals. Short stroke over square engines make peak horsepower and torque high in the rev range. This type of engine design usually allows for more or larger valves in the cylinder head. You'll find a majority of motorcycle engines use an over square design. Okay, so now that we know what displacement is, how it's determined, and how the configuration affects the different engine characteristics, let's take a look at some different common motorcycle displacement, what type of bikes they're found in, and of course, what all the spec sheet warriors would like to know, how much power they're making. Maybe we can figure out how a 2000cc Harley-Davidson engine manages to make as much power as a Ninja 650. Alright guys, taking a quick moment to pause and shout out the sponsor of today's video, Rockform. Rockform makes the best phone cases and handlebar mounts for motorcyclists, but it doesn't end there. If you get the Rockform case, that gives you access to the whole ecosystem of Rockform parts and accessories. You can put your Rockform on anything that has the Rockform mount. Their cases are drop tested and super durable, perfect for when you underestimate the power of a little two-stroke and yeet yourself over backwards. Even better, they have handlebar mounts for any style of motorcycle. The phone cases easily connect with the mounts for quick attachment, so no need to waste any precious time fiddling with a cheap knockoff mount. If you follow the link below and use the code YN25, you'll receive 25% off your order. Thank you, Rockform, for supporting the channel. Again, that is YN25 for 25% off your order from Rockform. Now back to the show. The smallest engine you'll find in a motorcycle in a street legal configuration is usually about 125 cc's. In America, those are pretty exclusive to mini bikes like the Honda Grom, Monkey, or Kawasaki Z125. In the EU, with their A1, A2 licensing system, 125cc motorcycles on the street are far more common, and there are a lot more options available for motorcycle riders who are just getting their feet wet in A1 purgatory. But since we operate here in the good old US of A as far as teeny tiny motorcycles go, I'm most familiar with the Grom, and I'll use that as the subject of my evaluation. The engine in a Honda Grom is about as simple as a modern motorcycle engine can be. It has a 124cc single-cylinder air-cooled 4-stroke engine. It has a bore and stroke of 50 by 63.1 millimeters, meaning it has a single piston with a bore of 50 millimeters that travels 63.1 millimeters within the cylinder during each phase of the engine cycle. At the crank, the Grom makes a claimed output of just shy of 10 horsepower and 8 foot-pounds of torque. And that's about it. Not much more to write home about with these little engines. A class of motorcycle that's becoming less and less common, although not entirely extinct, are 250cc bikes. These used to be found in both dual sport bikes as well as entry-level cruisers or sport bikes, but it seems most manufacturers are opting for at least 300cc's as their new beginner bike engine of choice. You really only see 250cc or approximately in dual sport bikes or the wretched Gixxer 250. Yamaha makes the XT250 was a pretty old school air-cooled dual sport equipped with a 249cc air-cooled single-cylinder thumper. This one makes 19 horsepower and 14 foot-pounds of torque. Or Kawasaki makes the KLX 230, which I don't really understand since they also make the KLX 300. But anyway, the 230 has a 233cc air-cooled single that makes 17 horsepower and 13 foot-pounds of torque. These are just kind of your standard back-road dual sport farm bikes, nothing super crazy. Now we're getting into the more traditional motorcycle displacements, 300cc's. Honda uses a trusty 286cc liquid-cooled single-cylinder engine in a bunch of different entry-level models. You'll find it in the CBR 300, Rebel 300, and CRF 300 to name a few. Each of these bikes make around 27 horsepower and 19 foot-pounds of torque. They all have slightly different power output, probably based on how they're tuned, but I don't feel like listing them all, so I average them. So sue me. Anyway, it's a good modern single cylinder that's a good platform for Honda's beginner bikes, regardless of their style. Similarly, Yamaha has a 321cc parallel twin that they use in both the MT-03 and R3 models. The Yamaha engine has a few advantages over the Honda. The extra cues of displacement definitely don't hurt, but it's also an even more overstroke engine design, allowing the R3 to rev all the way to 14,000 RPM. Both the MT-03 and R3 are making close to 40 horsepower and 20 foot-pounds of torque in the current model year. 400cc motorcycles could kind of be lumped into the same class as 300s. Approachable, beginner-friendly, you know the story. Two notable 400cc bikes are the Ninja 400 and the Husqvarna Svartpilen 401. The Husky uses the exact same engine as the KTM Duke 390, so most of the information about the Svart applies to the KTMs as well. The Ninja 400 uses a 399cc parallel twin engine that makes a claimed 49 horsepower and 28 foot-pounds of torque. The Svartpilen has a slightly smaller 373cc single-cylinder engine that makes 44 horsepower and 27 foot-pounds of torque. 500cc motorcycles aren't terribly common these days, but Honda does make the big snoozer CBR 500R. It's a 471cc parallel twin that makes a claimed 50 horsepower and 32 foot-pounds. The CBR 500 is one of the first bikes I've mentioned today that has a nearly perfect square engine with a bore and stroke ratio of 1.003. That may have something to do with the fact of why it's making the same peak horsepower as an Ninja 400 with 72 extra cubes of displacement. Things start to get more interesting when talking about 600s versus 650 class bikes, because without fail, a 600cc bike is going to make more power than a 650. 600cc bikes like the R6, ZX6R, it's 636cc's, but you get the point. And even the CBR 600R all make around 120 or 130 horsepower and 45 to 50 foot-pounds of torque. They all have high-revving, short-stroke inline-4 engines that make a lot of peak power far into the rev range. Whereas 650 class bikes are typically much more street-oriented. The Ninja 650 is a perfect example. It has a 649cc engine, which is 13 cc's larger than the 636cc power plant in the ZX6, while managing to make just 67 horsepower, nearly 50 less than the 636. But the engineers at Kawasaki aren't dumb. I mean, they bestowed us with the H2 after all. This is an intentional design for a bike with a different use. The ZX6 is meant for the racetrack of the Street Squid Kyle Energy. Its 4-cylinder engine makes power high in the rev range and is arguably an inconvenient way to ride a motorcycle on the street, whereas the Ninja 650 has a parallel twin engine that is less over square than the ZX6R, and is tuned to have more power, more accessible, low in the rev range, much more catered towards daily use. Yamaha has outright done with the R6, their 4-cylinder 600, in favor of the R7, which is a playful 270-degree crank parallel twin, making more accessible power and torque at the expense of peak horsepower. There are a ton of different middleweight motorcycles that all come in below 1000 cc's and are going to be making more power than your average going 650, like the MT-09 or Duke 890. When it comes to leader bikes or largers, it only starts to get confusing when comparing 4-cylinder race bikes or hyper-naked bikes against gargantuan American V-twin engines, which, for most sensible motorcycle enthusiasts, is not a comparison we're likely to make, because that's kind of beating a dead horse at this point. But old Harley dads still think that a 600cc motorcycle is a beginner bike, and their 2000 plus cc 131 cubic inch crate engine in their Road King is a real bike, even though after $15,000 in aftermarket parts and labor, it's still barely making 140 horsepower. When you can instead get any leader bike and get close to 200 horsepower to the wheel with an exhaust and tune. And why is that? Because I mentioned at the very top of the episode, Harley engines are under square, so the long stroke creates plenty of low down torque, but has a red line lower than a diesel truck. If you can't rev high, it's really hard to make huge horsepower numbers. Thanks for making it to the end of the video. Did this clear anything up for the noobs out there that thought their Ninja 650 was pretty fast? Be sure to subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Fact: a duck is called a duck because it ducks its head under the water to feed. The animal was named after the verb and not the other way around. Goodbye.